This is the politics of everything, and I'm your host, Amber Daines. Welcome to the podcast where we want to discuss the politics of everything, from money to motherhood, nutrition to narcissism, startups to secularism, the environment to equality, and much more. Our guests are experts in their field or topic of choice, even if you've not yet heard their name. This is a bipartisan podcast, so while we love exploring varied views and get a buzz from a healthy debate, by no means is this a one-sided forum for any one political view. So please listen up and enjoy the politics of everything. Being authentic can be described as a buzzword in the entrepreneurial world. Being a leader who is authentic has been linked to being more respected and admired by those around you. My guest today is tackling this very topic head on. At 5 foot zip, Joanne Schonheim, or Jo, prefers to be anything other than average and always strives to achieve her version of success on her own terms. Be careful in asking her what she thinks. She may just tell you. Growing up in family businesses spanning 3 generations, Jo preferred sitting in on the boardroom conversations to sitting outside playing with dolls. By 25, Jo had lived on 3 continents, circumnavigated a midlife crisis, started her own award-winning business, and married her best friend. Her talent and passion for business and product has led her to work with some of the biggest retailers in buying, national account and sales manager roles. She's a wife, a mother to 2 daughters, and has first-hand experience in what it means to truly co-parent while pursuing equally important career ambitions. Here today, Jo will decipher the politics of authenticity. Hey, Jo, welcome.
Hi, Amber. Thanks so much for having me as one of your panelists today.
So growing up, how would you describe your interest at school in either the classroom or your spare time? Were you that creative kid, the sporty kid, the maths geek? Where were you really finding your groove?
I'm a little bit of an anomaly. I sort of both very left brain and right brain, so I don't think I really fitted into a specific pigeonhole. I really loved school and was a straight A student. My favorite subjects were geography because I really loved learning about other cultures, especially. I loved English because I really loved the power of the written word. I loved economics because it was very conceptual. And I guess my real forte was art, which I guess is a visual form of communication. And again, very conceptual and a way to express yourself. So I used to stay up until the wee hours of the morning working on my assignments, even in primary school, decorating, individualizing each page. And from a very young age, I was really ambitious and wanted to be an art director in advertising. I guess I was really fascinated by consumer psychology and tapping into people's authenticity in terms of understanding what led to the decision-making processes. In my spare time, I did art and dance and was also a youth leader. And I think in that youth group was where I really learned to give myself permission to really be myself as I was respected and my voice was heard.
That sounds interesting. So it sounds there's so much of a mix there in some ways, like you say, the left and right brain, which is great when you're going to be an entrepreneur later on in life because I think you need all of that. But I guess you probably had an earlier career that was not necessarily straight away where you are now. What did you do in your early career and why did you do it?
I love to tell the story of my first job, which I couldn't wait to get my first job. So at exactly 14 years and 9 months, I went up the road to the local bakery and you can laugh if you like. It was called Mr. Krusty. And that was my first, yeah, no joke, not making this stuff up. That was my first foray into customer service and being customer facing. And I learned very quickly there, because it was such a sort of mechanical job, that if you connected with people on a really human level, that your job was more fun, your day went faster, and that people really enjoyed being served by you because you had that human touch. After uni, I was headhunted to be an assistant.
Oh, by the way,
buyer.
what did you study at uni? Just let me jump in there. What did you study? I'm feeling like it's going to be something creative, but it may not be.
That was part of circumnavigating my midlife crisis. So I had the marks to go and do economics or business or law, and I decided to follow my passion, which was art. Having said that, I knew that I would never actually be a professional practicing artist. I always say that I'm not crazy enough. I'm too pragmatic to be a professional practicing artist, but I knew that if I didn't get that out of the way early, that I'd probably go off and have some big high-powered corporate career and then quit everything at 40 and go back to uni to study art. So yeah, so I majored in drawing and painting because I figured that if I did end up doing anything in design, that those are the fundamentals and the absolute basics. And again, it's always about stripping things back to the rawest form, which I guess in a way kind of ties back to the whole thing of authenticity.
Absolutely. So after uni, where did that lead you in terms of a career job, if you like?
So as I was saying, I was headhunted to be an assistant buyer for a jewelry company. So I first went for a job with one company, and then the competition heard that I was going with them, so they jumped in. The one that I ended up taking, I was just reflecting back on it a little while ago about how that was probably my first proof of concept to myself, I guess, in terms of being authentic in the workplace and being true to myself and standing up for that. So my boss wanted to massively underpay me, probably because of my age and because it was such a coveted position to get at, the ripe age of 20. Most people spend 20 years in their career trying to get to that position. Anyway, he put a job offer on the table, and I did the maths, and I came back and I said, listen, I can make that being a waiter. So don't really know why I would choose to come and work for you and work so much harder and longer hours and bring so much more value to the table for basically a waiter's wages without any tips. And you can see he was like totally taken aback. And he said, well, what do you think you should be paid? So like in the movies, I wrote a number on a piece of paper and I slid it across the table, and he looked at it and he looked up at me and was like, wow, I don't think I've ever had anyone do this to me, especially at your age, but yeah, okay, I agree. And then I said, I have a second condition to coming to work for you. And he's like, what's that? And I said, I don't do dolphins. He's like, what do you mean you don't do dolphins? And I said, well, in fine jewelry, I know that, some of your bestsellers, especially amongst the younger demographic, really love.
This is dating you, Joe. I'm remembering dolphin jewelry in a matching set.
Yes, in a matching set with maybe a little hands curled around the dolphin that was jumping through the air, curled around the dolphin in the shape of a love heart. So I said, yeah, I don't do that cliched crap. And if you want me to be a buyer for you, I don't do kitsch. And that's one of the reasons why I want to work for you, is because your stuff is really classy. So if you are going to make me buy dolphins, then that's the line in the sand. I'm not doing it.
I love the fact that you knew who you were even at the ripe old age of 20 in your first job.
Absolutely. And it's actually paid off ever since, because I've realized that I can basically sell anything. But in order to do that, I have to align myself with the company that I believe in their values. And I have to believe in the product or the service that I'm selling, because then I'm not selling, then I'm just being authentic in terms of I'm personally advocating for something I personally would put my money towards. And yeah, then I just see it as helping people get the best deal for the best product. So yeah, it's served me well in future careers.
So that leads me to the big question. How would you define the authentic self, or authenticity in its purest form?
Again, even though I said I don't like cliches, but I guess cliches are there for a reason, because they're true. I guess I would define authenticity, or your authentic self, as being true to yourself. So really connecting to the inner you, but I mean the one without noise. So the one without the filter of self-criticism, the awareness and worry of what others may think of you. I guess it's how you would behave when no one was looking, and what you would say if your thoughts were subtitles. So for me, authentic self is your inner voice, and it's your internal rudder. So it always knows where you should go, what you should do next, and what you really want to say without the internal censorship. It's your inner quiet, basically.
Absolutely. So there's a well-known TED talk called The Power of Authenticity, which I looked at again in preparation for our chat today. The guy's called Mike Robbins. He's not necessarily well-known, but it was from the TEDxGreenbrookSchool. And I love the way the speaker and the author shares that idea that we need to be ourselves because everyone else is taken. And that's kind of the book that he wrote, which is a fantastic title. What impact does that simple but truthful idea have for you, and how do you interpret that in your life and how you operate?
I guess I'd also say that I really align myself with what he says in terms of the fact that everybody else is already taken. And to answer your question, I guess it's in these days of intense competition, I think you really need to understand what your unique proposition is. So that's why it's so important to be your authentic self, because as he said, there is only one of you. And if all you're trying to do is to conform to the masses, then you're just one more robot, one more clone. And as I like to say, just one more shade of beige, and the world doesn't need more beige. So I see it as it's a your authentic self is that you're a gift and you were put on this earth to share that. And if you think that you're not interesting enough to be yourself and that you'd be, far more interesting if you were a different version of it, I think that you're far more interesting and have a far more newsworthy story than you give yourself credit for. If you think that you're fairly stock standard and terribly unremarkable, well, I have a news flash. You're not. You're just not very connected to your authentic self. You're not sharing your real story. You're not boring. It's your filtered self that doesn't show vulnerability that is boring.
No, that's a great way of summing it up.
Does that make sense?
What do you think? Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the flip side of it is, what do you think the consequences are for people not being authentic? You have touched on that idea of you'll just be seen as beige and so forth. But what do you think the personal consequence is if you don't actually live your true self?
Well, I think if you're not willing to be authentic, then don't be surprised when you get more of what you don't want and less of what you do. Unless you represent yourself accurately, honestly, and authentically, you'll be attracting the wrong thing. I'm a firm believer in that we teach people how to treat us. So if you don't express how you feel and you don't let people in and you don't draw your boundaries at the get-go for how you'd like to be treated, people will make their own rules and ultimately decide for you. So I think that's the real cost that you're going to pay for not being authentic. Because if you're not being authentic, you're actually in the business of false advertising. So, the rules of engagement aren't clear. So I guess the flip side of that, if you show up as you are, you own it, you own your feelings and you take responsibility for them and be prepared to back them and be prepared to back yourself. Because if you're not able to do that, then you have a self-esteem issue or self-worth challenges to work on. And I guess those two things really underpin being authentic. So you need to be either super comfortable with who you are, not because you're perfect, but because you actually recognize and accept that you are perfectly imperfect and that who you are at this very minute is enough.
I think that's the key to it, isn't it? Knowing you are enough. And I think authenticity, unfortunately, is a bit of a buzzword in business at the moment. So probably in some ways takes away from what the true meaning of it is and the true value of it. In your business life, so you've obviously gone on to a more corporate career, and we have skipped, I guess, a couple of chapters in that. But in your corporate experience, what has that shown to you or backed up for you about the power of being authentic to change how we operate at our best so that we can all enjoy work, but also you're doing your best? Has that been something you've been really conscious of, or has it just been
absolutely
status quo for you and that's how you operate?
Absolutely. To be honest, it's one of the things that I find the most challenging in corporate is that in corporate, we're so taught to be robots and to just be yes men and to manage upwards. And I just am a firm believer that that doesn't do what's for the greater good of the business and it doesn't yield the right results. I've worked in many teams where the culture was really toxic and people were very miserable and had basically just been beaten into submission. People were afraid. They were afraid to say what they actually thought. They were afraid to connect with their team and to reveal what they would perceive as weakness. A big thing that I think is really important, and I always try and share this with people that I become closer to, is that I don't believe that vulnerability is weakness. I actually believe that vulnerability is strength. So whenever I go into one of those toxic teams, one of the first things that I do is start working on the team dynamics. I do that usually by using humor as a way of breaking the ice and diffusing the tension within the team. And within that, I show a bit of vulnerability and share some of my stories. And when you put skin in the game, people then feel safe to step towards you and share a little bit of their story too and start to become real. The other thing that I've done in corporate in terms of trying to change the way that we operate so we can be our best is encouraging people to question their tactics. So if we're in a group meeting and we're discussing strategy, we've got a problem and we're trying to overcome it and people come up with their suggestions, I ask them, are we doing this with the intention to actually move the needle, or are we doing it just to tick a box to say we tried, but we already know from the get-go that we're not going to be successful at this. So I guess that's about questioning people's authenticity and asking them to bring their authentic selves and what they really think is going to be going to work. Because if you're not going to put effort in something that you think is going to work, then you're just wasting everybody's time. So there's so much power in being authentic, especially in the corporate workplace, if A, will have a better team culture and B, will yield better results, because we're actually not in denial. We're facing how things actually are. We're bringing our best version of ourselves to the game, and we're working better together as a team because we implicitly trust each other more, and we trust each other with being compassionate towards each other and having a deeper understanding and connection with who we are.
Absolutely. So what are some of the obvious advantages of being authentic or avoiding that? And is there a personal example where you can maybe share your own vulnerability, because that's the theme now that you've put us onto, very Brene Brown of you, I love it, around the idea that, you know, if you don't do it, what are the consequences for everybody, but also, you know, what are the advantages of doing it? So maybe a little story from your own experience of maybe where you weren't as authentic as you could have been and how it panned out and what you might have done differently even.
So in terms of what the advantages are of being authentic versus avoiding it, I guess to be pretty blunt, I get what I want more often because I'm able to influence and persuade people because they hear that I'm the real deal. They can trust that I mean what I say and that I say what I mean. I guess when you're dealing with a straight shooter like me, you can see that I don't have a hidden agenda. So it builds trust and rapport really quickly. That means I put skin in the game, and I put skin in the game very early on because I believe that, as I said before, it gives permission for other people to do so. And I guess I'll give you a positive story about that, and then I'll try and find you a negative one. But a positive story about that is that when I go through interviews, I very rarely ever have to go through the final hoops of the interview. So I get fast-tracked to the job offer part because I think people feel very comfortable very early on with who they're dealing with, and they understand and have a solid understanding of the unique proposition that I bring because I understand my unique proposition very clearly. So that's one of the real
And do you articulate that, or do you hope people kind of get it? Like if you don't know someone, how are you able to do that very quickly?
I actually articulate it, to be honest. And obviously there's always the risk of seeing up yourself. But I don't know. I just think that no one else is going to be your advocate. No one else is going to champion you and be your cheerleader. So you just do it in a diplomatic way and with a level of self-awareness. And I guess also self-deprecating humor can really help to counter that. So it shows that you're a big believer in yourself and that you understand your unique proposition, but you also can poke fun at yourself, which also means that you're open to feedback, you know, constructive feedback, or even if it's quite a bitter pill to swallow. And I think that puts people at ease. Do you still want me to find an example of when it didn't work?
If there isn't one, that is okay. I just thought we'd play and see if there was something where there might be a lesson for other people, or maybe they can relate to it. Because I think, to be honest, the way you operate is not the way a lot of people operate initially. Like I think people get to a point where they do, but maybe not so early in the process of maybe a workplace or a relationship or whatever it might be.
So I do have a little bit of a reputation for having foot and mouth disease. Because I am so, to use the word authentic. So I'll often say stuff that other people will interpret as fairly outrageous, like I can't believe you said that. So I'll give you an example of one of my more recent roles. I was interstate doing an induction and being introduced to like 150 people all in one go. And so obviously it was very hard to keep up with who everybody was who in the zoo. And people were just being like paraded through the door and being introduced. So one guy walked in and he was wearing a pair of like, you know, nice chinos and an ironed polo top. And he looked very respectable, but he didn't look like he was super formal, right? Or uptight. And so my colleague introduced me to him, and I shook his hand and said, "Nice to meet you." And I straight out just said, "So what do you do here?" And my colleague almost wet himself and fell off the chair, because apparently the guy that I just said straight out, "And what do you do?" was the CFO of the company.
Incredible.
And we ended up building a really great relationship because it just took out all of that formality from the beginning. Obviously, it was a really big risk, and I had to make a note to myself of be more careful because there are other, you know, more senior people in the business that if you pull that same line on them, they might not take to it as kindly. But I guess I was also judging my audience just by the way that he was dressed. I could see that he was probably less of an uptight, rule-following kind of guy.
Interesting. You sought out that in the room, which was totally fascinating.
Well, I read people subconsciously. to like a really great, intense level of detail without necessarily actually realizing it. But it's
not just about judging their shoes now, is it?
No, but I actually do think that judging someone by their shoes gives you an idea as to whether they're a reluctant corporate or not. Because if they've got the whole get up, but their shoes aren't polished, it means they really would probably be preferred to be wearing a pair of boardies and a singlet. The shoes, they think that nobody will notice. So it's a very reluctant part of their outfit.
Interesting. So fun to think about it like that. There is that risk, and you have touched on it in one of your previous responses, that being authentic or being sort of too upfront can be seen as obnoxious or self-righteous. Do you think there are times we need to, if not lie, but maybe pull back a bit for the greater good so that people feel comfortable and like and know us and trust us before we get to that point? Like, what's your feeling there?
Absolutely. And it's something that I'm constantly aware of, because I understand that, you know, not everybody loves the truth, and that my inherent confidence could be interpreted as obnoxious or self-righteous, especially if the other person has a lower self-esteem or a lower sense of a lower sense of self-worth. So I have to kind of counter that and be very aware of it. So there's always that inherent risk. And one of the ways that I diffuse that is, I believe that's what disclaimers are for. So if you preface something obnoxious or self-righteous by saying, at the risk of sounding obnoxious, and then you say blah, 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 then it's kind of like an antidote to it. And again, it shows self-awareness. And as I mentioned before, it's about knowing your audience and realizing that there's a time and a place for everything. But one of my major opportunities for growth, we'll call it, which is another nice way of saying one of my problems, is recognize the difference between intention versus impact. So I will always be acutely aware of what my intention is, but how it lands on the other person can be very, very different. And sometimes that disconnect or that delta can be a lot wider or a lot bigger than I'm comfortable with. So sometimes I have to deliver a milder version of my authentic self or my authentic opinion. And so I have to gauge what's the least I can say to still have the biggest impact and the greatest outcome, but bearing the least risk. And to answer your final part of that question, which I believe are there times when lying might be useful. So to sum it up in one word, family.
Not that I advocate lying,
family,
but,
family.
Offend everyone.
Family is a very good example of when to bite your tongue.
Oh, that's
the greater
interesting.
Good. And that's because those are not temporary relationships. So if I end up in a relationship with someone really toxic, I will very quickly break up with them. I don't believe in associating or hanging around or spending my valuable time or energy with people who are toxic. But with family, those relationships are following you to the grave, baby. So if ever there was a time to keep your eye on the end game, it's with family. So yes, white lies are often needed to keep the family peace.
That's very interesting. I love how candid you are about that. Maybe not everyone feels that way about their family. Some people, I think, feel like they can be their true selves with their family. So perhaps it depends on your family dynamic, but I totally relate to what you're saying. How does being more authentic affect you as a wife and mother? And I know that's a big question, but I think we often focus on the professional, and we have touched on this being family, but the people in your everyday life, are you the same with them as you are with people at work, or are there special rules with those that are nearest and dearest to you?
I think it comes down to sugarcoating. So
obviously small children are a bit different because, you know,
but the difference,
do they really want to know that their hair looks bad today? Probably not.
No, I'll tell them.
There you go.
No holds barred. So the difference between myself at home and myself at work is not all that different. The language that I use is probably different. But I don't sugarcoat things for neither my husband nor my kids. And yes, sometimes that means that I do deliver a fairly bitter pill to swallow. But with my kids especially, I treat them and talk to them like adults. I'm very, very real with them because I want them to build resilience and grit, and for them to be able to recognize and own their feelings and opinions. And so that's why I encourage them to argue back, just like my parents did with me, because I think that's how you encourage your children to be authentic, is to give them a voice. And the only way they're going to feel that they have a voice that's worth being heard is if they're given permission from a very early age that what they have to say is important. So choose your words carefully and make them count, and be prepared to back them. And if you can't back them, then I will argue back with you. So, yeah, I think it's pretty straightforward. There's not that much of a difference between my authentic self at home and my authentic self at work.
That's good to know, given the fact that's the topic of the day. So 2 questions I ask all my guests, and of course I'm going to ask you too. The first is, have there been any special mentors or people in your life, and what have they taught you about success and life more generally?
So I guess it comes back to what most people would say, which is like your parents and your spouse. So for me, my dad, I'm exceptionally close to. He's always been my biggest supporter and always taught me to embrace and to listen to my inner self, and has never tried to change me. Obviously, he's tried to help teach me life lessons, but he's probably taught me the most about success in life, and that success is actually a gauge of how closely you're living your life to that inner being, and what it is that you really do want, and what you really do think. With my mum, she's always taught me to be honest and to have integrity, and obviously that old adage of to treat people with kindness. But I think the interesting part about what my mum taught me about being nice and kind to others is it's not about being nice because of who they are and what you can see, but be kind to others because you never know what battle they're facing. So you need to have compassion for them and empathy for them, even if you don't know what it is that you're having compassion and empathy for. But just know that what you see on the surface is never the true sum of what that person is. And so, yeah, you should always be gentle with people until you get to know them better. And in terms of my biggest supporter, I'd say that that's my husband, and he's been a real mentor for me, especially in business in the early days, because I didn't go to university and study business. And he too grew up in a series of family businesses. So he's really helped me and helped build my foundation. On the one hand, he's my biggest support. On the other hand, I would challenge that perhaps he's not, because he
wears multiple hats, though. I guess that's the reality.
So if you just get he's not a practicing lawyer, but he's a lawyer. So if you just get an idea of what sort of personality type that is, so everything for him is about mitigated risk and keeping your cards close to your chest. And he went through his university days in politics, and he's a politician at heart. So we've often clashed many times and had many fights about the fact that I am so real and I speak my mind, because for him that's horrific. But as we've gotten older and moved through life's journey together, he's seen more and more the payoff that I've had from that, and how much bigger my payoffs are because I connect with people the way that I do, and I build such strong relationships and very, very quickly, and how I can forge relationships with total and utter strangers. And make incredible connections, and how I build my network through that. So I think he's finally coming around, and I think he's going through his own little personal journey of connecting more with his authentic self and wearing that more on his sleeve.
Oh, that's interesting. Finally, what would be your top 2 or 3 takeaway tips for anyone wanting to embrace the politics of authenticity?
So first one is, and it's really important to try and remember and understand this, is that you teach people how to treat you. The second thing is, I would say, own it. Just own it and everything that encompasses. And the final thing I'd say is that the sooner you give yourself permission to be your authentic self, the sooner you'll feel so much better, because we don't even realize how heavy the load is that we carry when we're trying to be something that we're not. It's absolutely exhausting. And when you shed that and you put it down, only then do you realize the weight that you were bearing and how much it opens you up and basically relieves you and allows you to breathe, and gives you the energy and the space and the emotional space to take on more of what you want when you let go of all that crap that you don't want. And the final thing that I'd say is, I would beg you to ask yourself, can you continue to afford not being your authentic self? Because you're paying a way bigger price than you think. So yeah,
that's great advice. Excellent. So much in half an hour. I love it. If you do want to connect further with Jo, I'll give you some contact details on our show notes through her LinkedIn profile. Until next time, keep well. Thanks for listening today. If you've enjoyed the politics of everything, we thrive on feedback. So please add a short review and share the podcast with your network, your friends and family. I'm also always on the hunt for fabulous new guests. So if you've got a view to share and an idea how to get our listeners excited, please email me at amber@bespokecomms, that's BESPOKECOMMS.com.au, and we'll be sure to get back to you. Until next time.